The Atlantic Ocean, 1943. At first light, it looks peaceful. Endless gray water stretching to the horizon, a calm so complete it almost feels merciful. But beneath that surface, the ocean is listening and hunting. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the longest, most relentless campaign of the Second World War. For Britain, this was not just another front. It was a lifeline. Every loaf of bread, every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every tank part, everything had to cross that cold, exposed ocean. If the sea lanes failed, Britain would starve. Factories would fall silent. The war would be lost without a single German soldier setting foot on British soil. Germany knew this. From occupied ports along the French coast, wolf packs of U-boats slipped into the Atlantic darkness. Long, narrow, almost fragile-looking vessels, they carried one devastating advantage: invisibility. They did not need to outgun the Allies. They only needed to remain unseen and unheard. The German submarine campaign had one simple objective: cut Britain's throat by severing its supply lines. Sink enough merchant ships, and the island nation would choke. Early in the war, the results were terrifying. Convoys were burning across the Atlantic. Tankers exploded in pillars of flame. Cargo ships snapped in half under torpedo strikes. Survivors clung to wreckage in freezing water that could kill a man in minutes. By 1943, the ocean had become a graveyard. The Allied answer was the convoy system. Dozens of merchant ships would travel together in tight formation, escorted by destroyers and corvettes armed with depth charges. In theory, strength in numbers offered protection. In practice, it created a slow-moving, noisy cluster of targets. To understand the danger these convoys faced, you have to understand how a U-boat hunted. Contrary to popular belief, submarines did not rely solely on sight. In the vastness of the Atlantic, especially at night or in heavy weather, visual contact was rare. Instead, German submariners trusted their ears. Inside the steel hull of a U-boat, operators would sit in near silence, headphones pressed tightly against their ears, listening through hydrophones, underwater microphones capable of detecting the faintest mechanical noise across miles of ocean. The sea carries sound differently than air: faster, farther, clearer. A ship's propellers churned the water in rhythmic pulses. Engines vibrated through metal hulls. Even the slight cavitation of spinning blades produced a distinct acoustic signature. To a trained hydrophone operator, a convoy was not just noise, it was a symphony of targets, multiple ships, varying distances, shifting bearings. The ocean became a map drawn entirely in sound. And merchant ships were loud. They were not designed for stealth. They were built quickly, often crudely, to carry cargo in enormous quantities. Their engines rattled, their propellers thundered, their hulls groaned under stress. To a U-boat lurking beneath the waves, a convoy could be heard long before it was ever seen. The hunters would track the sound, calculate speed and direction, and then move into position. At night, they would surface, running on diesel engines, faster and more maneuverable than when submerged. They would slip into the convoy's perimeter like wolves among sheep. Then, one by one, they would fire. A single torpedo could erase a ship in seconds. For the men aboard merchant vessels, there was no warning siren, no dramatic buildup, just an impact, violent and sudden. The deck would lurch, steel would scream, lights would fail, and then the sea would rush in. Most merchant sailors were not career naval officers. Many were civilians, dock workers, engineers, cooks, young boys barely out of school. They sailed without the glory often associated with war. No medals pinned to dress uniforms, no triumphant headlines.
Yet they faced torpedoes and icy waters as surely as any soldier faced bullets, and they knew something terrifying. If their ship was hit in the North Atlantic winter, survival was unlikely. Water temperatures hovered near freezing. Hypothermia could claim a life in under 15 minutes. Lifeboats were fragile, rescue was uncertain, and U-boats sometimes lingered, waiting for escorts to drop their guard. By early 1943, shipping losses reached catastrophic levels. Entire convoys were mauled. Britain's imported food stocks dropped dangerously low. Rationing tightened. Civilian morale trembled. The phrase tonnage war became grimly real. It was a grim arithmetic, ships sunk versus ships built, and for a time, Germany was winning. The convoy system, while essential, had weaknesses. Gathering ships into large formations meant slower speeds, dictated by the slowest vessel. It created predictable routes, and worst of all, it amplified noise. Dozens of engines beating together into the sea made detection easier, not harder. Escort ships fought back with sonar, known then as ASDIC, and depth charges. They could sometimes detect a submerged submarine and launch explosives set to detonate at specific depths. But ASDIC had limitations. It struggled in rough seas, it lost contact easily, and it was often reactive. By the time a destroyer detected a U-boat, torpedoes might already be on their way. The ocean was vast, the escorts were few, and the U-boats were patient. Inside the steel hull of a German submarine, hydrophone operators could distinguish between distant merchant screws and the sharper, faster signatures of destroyers. They could estimate range by intensity. They could track movement through subtle shifts in sound. It was a deadly game of acoustic chess. Above the waterline, life aboard a convoy ship was a constant exercise in tension. Sailors slept in their clothes. Life belts were kept within arm's reach. At night, smoking on deck was forbidden. One glowing ember could silhouette a ship against the darkness. Blackouts were absolute. Windows were covered. Every man knew the drill if a torpedo struck. And yet, routine persisted. Meals were cooked, engines maintained, watches stood. Even laughter sometimes broke through the fear, because fear, if left unchecked, could paralyze a crew. The psychological toll was immense. Every strange vibration felt like a torpedo impact. Every distant explosion, real or imagined, tightened nerves further. Some sailors described it as waiting for an invisible executioner. The ocean gave no clues. A calm surface could hide a predator mere meters below. And when a ship ahead in the convoy suddenly erupted in flame, the shock rippled through every vessel behind it. Men would watch silhouettes against fire-lit smoke and wonder if they were next. They often were. The stakes extended far beyond the ships themselves. In Britain, families depended on those convoys. Wheat from North America, oil from the Caribbean, steel, ammunition, trucks, aircraft parts. Without them, factories would grind to a halt. Fighter planes defending British skies would lack fuel. Tanks preparing for future invasions would never roll. The Atlantic was not just a battlefield, it was an artery, and it was bleeding. By the spring of 1943, Allied leadership understood something had to change. Escort tactics improved, air cover extended farther into the Atlantic Gap. New technologies were rushed into service. Radar advanced. Code-breaking successes began to tilt intelligence in Allies' favor. But on the open sea, for the average merchant sailor, none of that erased the immediate reality. They were still audible, still traceable, still vulnerable. Every revolution of a propeller announced their presence to the deep. In the cramped listening stations of U-boats, operators leaned closer to their instruments, adjusting dials, isolating frequencies. Through static and ocean noise, they could hear it, the mechanical heartbeat of a convoy. There it is, bearing steady, range decreasing. For Britain, for the Allies, 1943 would become a turning point. But at its darkest moment, that outcome was far from certain. Ships were still sinking, men were still dying, and the Atlantic still belonged, in many ways, to the hunters below. Somewhere on one of those vulnerable merchant ships, amid the rumble of engines and the ever-present fear of torpedoes, an unlikely observer was listening too. Not through military equipment, not through advanced instruments, just listening. Because sometimes, in the middle of chaos, the person who changes history is not the admiral studying maps or the scientist in a laboratory. Sometimes it is the one who notices what everyone else has learned to ignore. And in 1943, on a loud, trembling merchant ship crossing the most dangerous ocean on Earth, that quiet act of noticing was about to begin.
He wasn't a naval officer. He didn't command guns. He didn't plot courses across the Atlantic with grease pencils and tense expressions. He worked below deck, where the air was thick with steam and the scent of boiled potatoes. Thomas "Tommy" Lawson was a cook. On paper, that made him one of the least important men on a merchant ship. He didn't steer, he didn't fire depth charges, he didn't scan the horizon for periscopes. His battlefield was a narrow galley with rattling pans and dented pots that slid with every roll of the hull. But war has a way of placing extraordinary moments in ordinary hands. Lawson hadn't set out to become part of naval history. He had gone to sea for the same reasons many men did: steady pay, a sense of movement, perhaps a quiet desire to escape the limits of shore life. The merchant marine was not glamorous, but it mattered. Without it, nothing moved. No food, no fuel, no war. His ship was one of many, functional, loud, perpetually vibrating. The engines never truly stopped. Even at anchor there was a hum, a metallic pulse that seemed to live in the bones of the vessel itself. The deck plates trembled, pipes clanged softly in their brackets, cutlery shivered if left too close to the edge of the table. For most aboard, the noise faded into background existence. It became the ship's heartbeat, constant, unavoidable, strangely comforting. But Lawson listened. A cook learns to notice small details: the change in smell when bread is about to burn, the subtle shift in flame beneath a pot, the difference between a simmer and a boil before the lid ever rattles. Attention keeps meals edible. Attention keeps morale intact. And morale mattered. The men he cooked for were exhausted. Merchant sailors in 1943 lived in a state of suspended dread. Every crossing could be their last. They joked loudly at mess tables, but the laughter often died quickly. They checked lifebelts before sleep. They memorized the quickest path to lifeboats in darkness. Lawson saw it in their faces when they lined up with metal trays in hand. Pale skin under dim lights, eyes flicking upward at every unusual vibration. He heard it in the silences between conversations. He could not fight U-boats, but he could feed the men who sailed through them. The galley was small, wedged deep within the ship's steel body. When the sea turned rough, pots had to be tied down. When the convoys zigzagged to avoid submarine attack, everything slid sideways. Cooking in wartime Atlantic waters required balance, patience, and an almost stubborn calm. It also required enduring the noise. The engines were relentless. A deep, grinding rhythm pulsed through the deck. When the propellers bit hard into heavy seas, the vibration intensified, an uneven shudder that traveled through pipes, bulkheads, even into the spoons stacked in drawers. Lawson sometimes felt it through his boots before he consciously heard it. Most days he worked through it without thought, until he didn't. It happened gradually, almost annoyingly. A night crossing, the ship moving in blackout conditions, no lights visible on deck, no smoking allowed. The convoy stretched across the dark ocean, each vessel separated by disciplined distance, yet bound together by shared risk. Lawson was below, preparing a late meal for men coming off watch. The engines were running steady. Then, during a slight course adjustment, something shifted. The vibration changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm an engineer, but enough for a man who spent hours standing on steel plates to notice. The sound deepened, then softened, then returned. He paused, ladle in hand. The ship always made noise, that was a fact of life, but this was different. The change had been subtle, almost like someone had dampened a drum with their palm before lifting it again. He dismissed it at first. Ships were temperamental beasts, engines strained, props cavitated, hulls flexed, nothing unusual. But over the following days he began to pay attention. When cargo tanks were partially filled or emptied, the ship's vibration altered. When the sea was calmer and the propellers turned more smoothly, the sound carried differently. When certain compartments were flooded with seawater ballast, the resonance shifted again. It was not scientific analysis, it was observation, and Lawson was good at observing. During long stretches between meals, he would stand still in the galley and simply listen. He would close his eyes and feel the rhythm through his feet. The ship was not just noise, it was layers of noise. Engine rumble, shaft rotation, propeller churn, the hollow echo of steel compartments. Sometimes, late at night, when most of the crew were asleep and only the watch remained on duty, he would step into a quieter passageway and lean his hand against the bulkhead. The ship vibrated like a living thing. He began asking casual questions. How full are the ballast tanks today? Running steady revolutions? Sea state calmer than yesterday? The engineers humored him. The cook was curious, nothing wrong with that. War created strange habits in men. But Lawson was forming a pattern in his mind. He had overheard conversations about hydrophones, the German ability to hear ships underwater from miles away. The officers spoke of it in low tones. Sound carried. That was the danger. Even in darkness, even in fog, a submarine could track them by the mechanical signature of their engines. Sound carried. The phrase lodged itself in his thoughts. If sound carried through water so efficiently, what exactly was the water hearing? He imagined a U-boat below, silent and patient, headphones pressed to ears, listening to the steady thrum of his ship's propellers slicing through the sea, listening to the vibration transmitted from engine to shaft to hull to water. Listening to them. The idea unsettled him more than torpedoes. A torpedo was violent, immediate, but being heard, tracked invisibly through miles of ocean, felt almost unfair. One evening, while scrubbing down a prep table, Lawson noticed something simple. A pot left partially filled with water on the stove vibrated differently than an empty one beside it. The water absorbed the rattle, muted it. He tapped the side lightly. Different tone. He froze. It was a small thing, almost laughably small, but his mind returned to ballast tanks, to compartments filled with seawater, to the way the ship's vibration changed depending on how much liquid it carried. Water absorbed vibration. Ships were hollow steel structures. Large sections echoed, resonated, amplified mechanical noise before it passed it into the surrounding ocean. What if... He stopped himself. It was a ridiculous thought. He was a cook, not a naval architect. Engineers designed ships, admirals commanded fleets, scientists studied acoustics. Who was he to question the noise of a 7,000-ton vessel? And yet, the idea refused to leave. What if the ship didn't have to be so loud? He began experimenting in the smallest ways possible, pressing sacks of flour against rattling panels to see if the vibration softened, placing folded cloth beneath metal trays, filling containers with water and setting them near vibrating surfaces. The differences were minor, barely perceptible, but they were real. He started imagining the entire ship that way, not as a rigid steel drum broadcasting its presence, but as something that could be dampened, softened, its mechanical heartbeat muffled before it reached the sea. It sounded insane. A ship could not simply be wrapped in pillows. You could not silence engines that powerful. And yet, ballast tanks already existed. Compartments already held seawater. What if they were used differently? What if water, strategically placed, could absorb and disrupt the vibration before it radiated outward? He didn't yet have the language for acoustic dampening. He had instinct, and instinct can be dangerous, because once you see a possibility, you cannot unsee it. Above deck, the Atlantic remained merciless. Convoys were still being stalked. Ships still vanished in pillars of flame. Each crossing carried the same question: would they arrive intact? Below deck, in a swaying galley lit by dim bulbs, a cook was staring at a pot of trembling water and imagining something no one had asked him to imagine. Could a ship be made quieter? Could steel be persuaded not to shout into the ocean? He knew the reaction he would face if he spoke up. Laughter, perhaps, dismissal, a reminder to stick to cooking. War did not reward foolish distractions. But men were dying, and if the enemy was listening, if the ocean itself had become a channel of betrayal, then maybe the answer was not bigger guns or faster escorts. Maybe it was silence. Lawson dried his hands and leaned against the counter as the ship rolled gently beneath him. He closed his eyes and listened, not as a cook.
By the time the idea fully formed in his mind, Lawson understood one thing clearly. If he said it out loud too quickly, it would die in laughter. Warships ran on hierarchy. Merchant ships were no different. Engineers trusted blueprints. Officers trusted experience. Sailors trusted routine. A cook suggesting a solution to submarine detection bordered on absurd. And yet, absurd ideas have a dangerous habit of being right. The Atlantic crossing was halfway complete when Lawson finally decided to test his thinking beyond pots and flour sacks. The sea was calmer than usual, the convoy maintaining steady formation. Below deck, the ship's engine rotated at a consistent rhythm, sending that familiar vibration through every steel rib of the hull. He stood in a ballast control space with one of the junior engineers, a man named Harris, who had tolerated Lawson's odd questions for days. "Humor me," Lawson said carefully. "When we adjust ballast, you ever notice the sound change?" Harris smirked. "Everything changes the sound. Load, trim, sea state." "But when the tanks are fuller," Lawson pressed, "doesn't it feel heavier, quieter?" The engineer shrugged. "Different resonance, maybe. Steel flexes less. Why?" Lawson hesitated. There it was, the line between curiosity and insanity. Cross it, and he risked being dismissed as a nervous cook losing his grip. "Because if it feels different up here," he said slowly, topping the bulkhead, "what does it sound like down there?" Down there, beneath them, beneath the keel, in the cold dark where hydrophones listened. Harris didn't answer immediately. The question lingered. Sound in water was not intuitive. It moved faster than in air, over 4 times faster. It traveled farther, losing less energy. A mechanical vibration inside a ship didn't stay inside. It transferred from engine mounts to hull plates, from hull plates into seawater, and then outward in expanding waves. The ship wasn't just moving through the ocean, it was broadcasting into it. Lawson had spent nights imagining the vessel as a bell being struck over and over again. Engines were the hammer, the hull was the bell, the sea carried the ringing. What if the ringing could be dampened before it ever reached the water? Water absorbed vibration. He had seen it in miniature. A pot filled with water rattled less than an empty one.
The liquid disrupted resonance. It broke up the clean metallic echo. Ships already carried thousands of tons of water in ballast tanks, but those tanks were designed for balance, not silence. They weren't positioned or filled with acoustics in mind. What if they were used deliberately, not just to stabilize the ship, but to muffle it? The idea was deceptively simple: strategic flooding of certain compartments to reduce hull vibration, to dampen resonance, to interfere with the clean transmission of propeller and engine noise into the surrounding sea. It sounded almost laughable. You couldn't just turn down a 7,000-ton cargo ship. But maybe you didn't need to silence it completely. Maybe you only needed to make it harder to track. Hydrophone operators relied on clarity, distinct rhythms, predictable acoustic signatures. If a convoy's sound profile became muddled, less sharp, less defined, range calculations would become harder, bearings less precise, attacks less certain. In war, uncertainty saves lives. Lawson and Harris conducted a crude test. With permission, under the pretense of trim adjustment, they altered the water levels in selected ballast tanks during steady cruising speed. Nothing extreme, nothing dangerous, just enough to change internal mass distribution. Then they listened. Above deck, nothing dramatic happened. The ship still moved forward, the engines still turned, but below, where steel met steel, something felt different. The vibration wasn't gone, but it was softer, less biting. The sharp metallic edge seemed blunted. Harris frowned. "I'll admit," he muttered, pressing his palm against a bulkhead, "that's not nothing." It wasn't proof, it wasn't data, but it was enough to push the idea further. The next step was riskier, presenting the thought to someone who outranked them both. The chief engineer was a practical man. Years at sea had carved skepticism into his personality. When Lawson began explaining his theory about resonance, about water dampening vibration, about confusing hydrophones, the older man stared at him in silence. "You're telling me," the chief finally said, "that by shifting ballast, we can make ourselves quieter to submarines?" "Not silent," Lawson corrected, "just less clear, less sharp, harder to pinpoint." The chief leaned back. "You're a physicist now, Cook?" "No, sir." "Then why do you think you've noticed something naval architects haven't?" "Because I stand on the deck plates every day, because I feel what they don't feel," Lawson thought. But he chose his words carefully. "Because we weren't trying to make ships quiet when we built them, we were trying to build them fast." That landed. Merchant ships of wartime were designed for speed of production, efficiency, cargo capacity. Acoustic stealth had not been a priority. Why would it be? Submarines had always been a threat, but hydrophone tracking at this scale had changed the game. The chief didn't laugh. He didn't approve the idea either, but he agreed to observe. Over the next leg of the journey, they ran controlled ballast configurations whenever sea conditions allowed. The goal was consistency, same speed, similar load, minimal external variables. They didn't have underwater microphones to measure output. What they had were instincts and educated guesses. And something else: convoy intelligence reports. When the ship reached port safely, the captain quietly passed along Lawson's observations through official channels. It was framed cautiously, not as a revolutionary breakthrough, but as a potential avenue worth investigation. Acoustic dampening through ballast manipulation. Weeks later, on another crossing, word returned. Naval researchers had conducted controlled hydrophone tests on a vessel using varied ballast distributions. The results were preliminary, but intriguing. Certain configurations did indeed alter the ship's acoustic signature. Not dramatically, not invisibly, but measurably. Lawson read the summary twice. Measurably. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with Atlantic wind. His insane idea was not insane. It was physics.
The science behind it became clearer as naval engineers took interest. A steel hull vibrates at specific frequencies depending on structural rigidity and internal mass distribution. Introduce fluid mass strategically, and those frequencies shift. Resonance patterns change. Some vibrations are absorbed, others scatter. The clean mechanical signature hydrophones rely on becomes less distinct. You couldn't silence a convoy, but you could blur it. German U-boat commanders depended on precision. A miscalculated bearing by even a few degrees could mean a torpedo passing harmlessly through empty water. A misjudged range could detonate too early or too late. In darkness, without radar advantage, sound was everything. Disturb the sound, and you disturb the hunt. Still, skepticism remained widespread. Many officers believed that improvements in air cover and escort tactics were already turning the tide. Why complicate ballast systems? Why risk stability for marginal acoustic gains? Because marginal gains accumulate. That was Lawson's quiet conviction. He was not chasing perfection, he was chasing survival odds. If even one torpedo missed because a hydrophone operator struggled to isolate a target, that's a ship saved, a crew saved, cargo delivered. He never claimed it would win the war, only that it might tilt a moment. Field tests expanded. Selected ships were instructed to experiment with ballast adjustments during convoy movement, recording engine strain, fuel consumption, and any noticeable differences in handling. Meanwhile, naval listening stations conducted comparative acoustic analysis when possible. The data was imperfect. Wartime rarely allows laboratory conditions, but patterns emerged. Ships configured with specific ballast distributions produced slightly less coherent acoustic signatures at certain frequencies associated with propeller cavitation. To civilians, it would sound trivial. To a hydrophone operator straining to isolate multiple targets in rough seas, it was not. And somewhere in the Atlantic, beneath layers of cold black water, a German submariner adjusted his headphones and frowned. The convoy was there. He could hear it, but it wasn't as clean as before. The rhythm felt muddled. He recalculated, adjusted bearing, waited for clarity that didn't fully return. Above him, steel hulls moved forward, unaware of the confusion below. Lawson remained what he had always been, a cook. He still rose before dawn to prepare breakfast. He still scrubbed pots as the ship rolled. He still listened.
By mid-1943, the Atlantic no longer felt invincible. It was still deadly, still vast, still cold enough to kill a man in minutes. But something subtle had shifted. Convoys were surviving crossings that months earlier might have ended in fire. No single change explained it. Air patrols were extending farther into the Atlantic Gap. Escort carriers now shadowed convoys, their aircraft scanning for periscopes and oil slicks. Radar had improved. Code breakers were prying secrets from encrypted German messages. Destroyers were better trained, more aggressive, more coordinated. And quietly, almost invisibly, some ships were beginning to move through the water differently. The ballast adjustments were no longer an experiment whispered about below deck. On select routes, certain merchant vessels were issued updated trim guidelines. Nothing dramatic, no official declaration of a revolutionary acoustic strategy. Just instructions. Fill these tanks under cruising speed. Maintain this distribution when in high-risk zones. Monitor engine strain. Report anomalies. To an outside observer, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, the ocean was telling a slightly different story. In the cramped hydrophone rooms of German U-boats, operators were trained to recognize patterns. They could distinguish between a tanker and a freighter, between a destroyer and a cargo liner, by subtle differences in propeller cadence. Years of practice had sharpened their ears into precision instruments. Convoys once sounded like orchestras warming up, layered but distinct. Individual ships could be isolated, tracked, targeted.
Now, at times, the sound seemed blurred. Not silent, never silent, just less clean. One U-boat commander recorded in his log a frustration shared by others. Convoy noise appeared diffused under certain conditions. Bearings fluctuated slightly. Range estimates required longer confirmation. Torpedo solutions took more time to refine. And in submarine warfare, time was oxygen. The longer a U-boat remained in firing position, the greater the risk of detection by escorts. The more corrections required before launching torpedoes, the higher the chance that the convoy would shift course or that a destroyer would close in. Above the water, Allied escort captains did not know that ballast configurations were complicating enemy calculations. They only knew that, in some engagements, torpedoes missed by narrow margins. A wake streaking past astern instead of striking it. An explosion detonating yards off a hull rather than beneath it. Near misses. In war, near misses matter. On one North Atlantic crossing, a convoy encountered a coordinated wolfpack attack. Multiple submarines shadowed the formation through darkness, attempting to penetrate its perimeter. Hydrophones picked up the convoy's approach well before visual contact. The U-boats maneuvered into position. And then something went wrong. Solutions that should have been clean were inconsistent. One submarine launched a spread of torpedoes based on calculated bearing and range. Two detonated prematurely. One passed behind its intended target. Another ran deep. The convoy scattered briefly, escorts charging toward suspected positions, depth charges rolling off stern racks into black water. The engagement ended with damage, but fewer losses than expected. Afterward, Allied analysts pieced together fragments of intercepted German communications. Complaints surfaced about unreliable acoustic clarity during certain engagements. Some blamed sea conditions, others blamed operator fatigue. Few imagined that part of the explanation lay inside the very ships being hunted. The science, as naval engineers refined it, was not magic, it was resonance control. Every mechanical system produces vibration at specific frequencies. A ship's engines, shafts, and propellers create dominant tones, acoustic fingerprints. When those vibrations pass through rigid steel hulls without interruption, they transmit efficiently into surrounding water. But alter the internal mass distribution, introduce fluid mass in specific compartments, and you change how those frequencies behave. Some are dampened, others shift slightly. Harmonics distort. The overall signature becomes less sharply defined. Hydrophones still detect noise, but instead of a clean outline, they receive a smudged silhouette. In controlled tests near Allied naval facilities, ships configured with modified ballast patterns were monitored by underwater listening devices at varying ranges. The results were modest but consistent. At certain speeds, acoustic intensity at key frequencies dropped enough to reduce detection range by measurable margins. A mile less detection distance might not sound significant. At sea, it could mean everything. It could mean a U-boat acquiring contact minutes later than usual. It could mean an escort vessel closing the gap before torpedoes were optimally aligned. It could mean a convoy passing just beyond effective attack positioning. Lawson did not attend these tests. He remained what he had always been, a cook aboard a merchant vessel, crossing hostile waters with men who depended on hot meals and quiet reassurance. He did not sit in strategy meetings. He did not receive medals. But word filtered back to him in fragments. They're trying your ballast idea on other ships. Naval boys are studying the sound output. Seems to make tracking a bit harder. He never celebrated. He understood the scale of war too well. Ships were still being sunk. Men were still vanishing into freezing water. No ballast adjustment could erase that reality. Yet convoy loss rates began to decline. Historians would later credit many factors for the turning point of 1943. Improved air coverage closed the deadly mid-Atlantic gap.
Long-range bombers hunted submarines. Escort carriers changed convoy defense. Intelligence breakthroughs disrupted wolfpack coordination. All of it was true. But war is rarely turned by one sweeping innovation alone. It shifts through accumulation, small advantages layered upon each other until momentum changes direction. Acoustic dampening was one of those layers, not dramatic enough for headlines, not visible enough for propaganda, but real. On a later crossing, Lawson stood on deck during a rare, calm evening. The sea stretched outward in muted blue-gray under a fading sun. The convoy moved steadily, columns of ships cutting parallel paths through open water. He leaned against the rail and listened, not with fear this time, but with curiosity. The engine still throbbed beneath him. The ship still vibrated. Nothing felt radically different, and yet, somewhere below, those vibrations were traveling through water in altered form. Somewhere below, perhaps, a submarine operator strained to isolate a target and found the task slightly harder than before. He imagined that unseen listener adjusting dials, narrowing focus, waiting for clarity that never fully sharpened. It wasn't victory, it was friction. Friction introduced into the enemy's process. Friction that bought time. Friction that disrupted certainty. And certainty is a weapon in submarine warfare. Reports from convoy escorts increasingly described U-boats forced to take greater risks, surfacing more often at night to gain visual confirmation, closing distances that exposed them to radar and aircraft. As the acoustic edge dulled, the hunters adapted, but adaptation carried danger. Submarines that once relied heavily on passive listening found themselves navigating a more complicated soundscape. Convoys were not silent, but their acoustic footprints were less predictable. Combined with improved Allied coordination, this created a narrowing window of opportunity. By late 1943, the tide of the Atlantic battle had unmistakably shifted. U-boat losses mounted. Allied shipping losses dropped. The once dominant wolf packs were being hunted in return. No single innovation deserved full credit, but every innovation mattered. Somewhere in naval archives, technical memoranda documented ballast distribution experiments and their acoustic implications. Engineers refined models. Designers began considering sound in new ship constructions. The idea that a vessel could manage its acoustic presence, could think not only about speed and cargo, but about how loudly it spoke to the ocean, had entered naval thinking. It had begun with a cook listening to a pot of water tremble, and now convoys were crossing with slightly better odds. For the men aboard those ships, the difference was invisible. They still scanned the horizon for periscopes. They still slept in clothes. They still flinched at sudden noises. But more of them were arriving in port. More of them were stepping onto solid ground. More letters were reaching home, instead of condolences. In war, that is the measure that matters. As 1943 drew towards its end, the Atlantic remained unforgiving, but it no longer belonged to the hunters alone. Beneath the waves, hydrophones still listened. Above them, steel hull still moved forward. But between engine and ocean, something had changed. The ships were no longer shouting quite as clearly into the darkness. And in that slight, stubborn reduction of noise lay...
When the war finally began to loosen its grip on the Atlantic, there was no single moment of silence, no dramatic hush where the ocean suddenly forgot how to kill. The convoys kept moving, the engines kept turning, the sea remained cold and indifferent, but the balance had shifted. By late 1943 and into 1944, the wolf packs that once ruled the shipping lanes were retreating, hunted by the very forces they had terrorized. The Battle of the Atlantic would eventually be remembered as a triumph of coordination, technology, and endurance. Radar, escort carriers, code-breaking, long-range aircraft, industrial production on a scale the world had never seen. Few would remember ballast tanks. Fewer would remember a cook. Thomas "Tommy" Lawson did not step off his ship into parades. There were no newspaper headlines declaring that an ordinary merchant seaman had helped blur the ears of German submarines, no medals pinned in front of cheering crowds, no speeches. He went back to work. Meals still had to be cooked, men still had to be fed. War did not pause for recognition. In the months that followed the turning point of 1943, convoy survival rates steadily improved. Losses did not vanish, but they dropped. The Atlantic lifeline held. Britain did not starve. American industry continued to pour ships, fuel, and weapons into Europe. Preparations for the invasion of the continent accelerated. History would later focus on the great offensives, the landings, the battles, the surrender ceremonies, but none of that would have been possible if the Atlantic had been lost. The war at sea was not glamorous, it was arithmetic. Tonnage delivered versus tonnage sunk, steel launched versus steel resting on the ocean floor. Every merchant ship that arrived intact meant aircraft assembled, tanks fueled, civilians fed. And survival in that arithmetic often depended on margins, a torpedo missing by yards, a U-boat detecting a convoy minutes too late, a firing solution calculated with just enough uncertainty to fail. Lawson's idea did not eliminate submarines, it did not silence ships, it did not win the war on its own. What it did was introduce doubt into the enemy's certainty. It forced hydrophone operators to work harder for clarity. It nudged detection ranges. It contributed, quietly, to a growing list of small advantages that accumulated into momentum. War is often remembered through grand strategy and towering personalities. Admirals standing over maps, scientists in laboratories, politicians delivering speeches. But survival frequently depends on the unnoticed observer. After the war, as merchant fleets returned to peacetime service, naval architects began paying more attention to acoustics. Sound was no longer an afterthought. Submarines would become more advanced. Anti-submarine warfare would evolve. The ocean would remain a domain of listening and counter-listening. And the idea that a ship's internal configuration could influence how it was heard beneath the waves became part of that evolving understanding. Lawson never claimed ownership of a revolution. Those who knew the story understood how fragile it had been in the beginning, a thought sparked by a vibrating pot, a question asked at the risk of ridicule, a handful of quiet experiments during dangerous crossings. It would have been easier to say nothing, easier to remain the cook who did his job and left strategy to others. But war has a way of amplifying the cost of silence. On long post-war evenings, when the Atlantic crossings were no longer shadowed by torpedoes, Lawson would sometimes stand on deck and listen out of habit. The engine's pulse still traveled through steel, the sea still swallowed sound. But he knew something he hadn't known before 1943. He knew that even massive systems, steel hulls, naval doctrines, global conflicts, could be nudged by a single persistent question. What if this could be different? The men he had fed during those crossings carried their own memories home. Some remembered the explosions in the distance. Some remembered the nights when escorts raced toward unseen enemies. Some remembered the strange tension that never fully eased until land appeared on the horizon. Few knew that beneath their boots, ballast water had been arranged with more than stability in mind. Few knew that somewhere below, in the darkness, a submarine operator might have struggled just a little longer to define their ship's position, and that struggle might have meant survival. History does not always record the smallest turning points. It prefers clear causes and dramatic effects. It prefers heroes in uniform, breakthroughs in laboratories, politicians delivering speeches. But sometimes history bends quietly. In 1943, the Atlantic was a killing ground. Britain stood on the edge of starvation. Merchant sailors crossed an ocean that seemed determined to erase them. German U-boats listened with mechanical patience, confident in their advantage. Then, somewhere between engine vibration and seawater ballast, that advantage was blurred. Not erased, blurred. And blurring was enough. because war is not won only by overwhelming force. It is won by accumulated edges, by every improvement that makes survival slightly more likely than destruction. Thomas "Tommy" Lawson never commanded a fleet. He never designed a warship. He never sat in a strategy room. He listened. He noticed. He asked a question no one expected from a cook. And in doing so, he reminded us of something easy to forget. Innovation does not belong to rank. Insight does not require title. And the line between ordinary and extraordinary is often drawn only by the courage to speak when something doesn't make sense. The Atlantic kept its secrets. Thousands of ships still rest on its floor, silent monuments to a brutal campaign. But thousands more reached harbor. Cargo unloaded, families fed, armies supplied, a nation sustained. Some of those ships arrived because radar improved, because air cover extended, because destroyers hunted relentlessly. And some arrived because their steel hulls no longer rang quite as loudly into the deep. In the end, the ocean was still listening. It just wasn't hearing the same story anymore.